I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow because the monarchy had survived scandals, betrayals, broken marriages, and public storms before, but this was entirely different. This was not gossip whispered behind heavy palace walls, but a formal judgment delivered in cold, unyielding legal language that left King Charles visibly shaken and Queen Camilla stripped of something far more powerful than jewels. In one single ruling, the illusion of certainty around her royal position cracked wide open. Charles sat in a quiet room at Buckingham Palace with the official ruling open before him, reading the final paragraph once, then again, unable to believe the words printed on the parchment. The judges had ruled that Camilla had absolutely zero legal claim to a protected collection of royal heirlooms connected to the late Queen's private line, including historic jewels, ceremonial pieces, and personal objects carried through centuries of royal memory. Camilla watched him from across the dim room, staying silent because she did not need anyone to explain the permanent damage done to her reputation. A royal heirloom means an object preserved because it carries family history, status, and emotional power, not just financial worth, and the ruling confirmed these pieces were not marital possessions, not items gained through marriage, and not crown property under her influence. The crown means the legal and symbolic authority of the monarchy itself, but even that immense authority had limits here, and Charles could not redirect these treasures on her behalf no matter how much he wished to protect his wife. The silence inside the room became unbearable as Charles lowered the file onto the wooden table, and that simple gesture told Camilla everything she feared. He felt a deep humiliation rising because the judgment did not only deny his wife, it exposed a clear boundary around his own power as king. She felt it too, but for her, the wound was entirely different because the queen consort had been told in law that her high title did not open every locked door in the palace. A sealed appendix attached to the document changed the mood completely, referencing a protective family instruction that had shaped the case from the very beginning. Palace aides understood the danger at once because the judges had not only rejected Camilla's claim, they had followed a private instruction powerful enough to limit the ruling king himself. Charles rose without speaking a single word, leaving Camilla remaining still, deeply wounded by what had just been taken from her future. Near the doorway, one anxious aide whispered that William and had to be informed before she made her next move, but the ruling was only the beginning because behind the legal defeat stood four people whose private wounds were now about to collide in public. A court ruling can look clean and orderly on paper, but inside a royal family, every sentence carries blood memory and betrayal. For Charles, it was public humiliation. For Camilla, it was total rejection. For William, it was protecting the future. And for Princess Anne, it was absolute duty. The judges had spoken, but the emotional battle belonged entirely to the people left standing in the ruins of their own household. Charles felt the judgment follow him long after the file had been closed and locked away. The words had been purely legal, but the wound was deeply personal because he was the king, the man expected to stand above uncertainty, yet the ruling had made one thing painfully clear to the world. His sovereign authority could not override the late queen's protected wishes, and that mattered because the monarchy survives not only through golden crowns and grand ceremonies, but through strict obedience to memory. If Charles appeared to bend that memory for Camilla, the damage would be larger than mere embarrassment, suggesting the crown itself could be shaped by private emotional pressure. Camilla carried a different pain because she had spent long, difficult years stepping into a role that never fully belonged to her in the public heart, and now the court had drawn the line in language no palace statement could ever soften. Marriage had brought her status, access, and proximity to power, but it had not given her inheritance through trust, bloodline, or royal memory. A trust in plain terms is a protected arrangement that controls who can use or inherit certain assets, and for Camilla, that distinction cut deep into her soul. She was accepted beside Charles, but not inside every sacred chamber of the family's past. William knew the meeting ahead would not be simple, so he sat with Catherine before entering the room, speaking carefully and weighing every single word before it left his mouth. The heirlooms carried Elizabeth's legacy, but they also carried Diana's shadow, and the prince understood why that made the issue incredibly explosive for everyone involved. Catherine listened closely, aware that one wrong sentence could turn necessary duty into cruelty, but William was not trying to punish Camilla. He was trying to protect symbols that had already survived too much pain and must be preserved for his own children. And arrived without hesitation because she did not need reassurance, and she never sought approval from anyone. The princess believed the heirlooms were never meant to become tools in Camilla's struggle for legitimacy, and that conviction made her calmness feel even sharper. Then, the palace inventory records changed everything because several disputed pieces had already been quietly requested for future use before the judges delivered their ruling. Charles discovered something worse, learning that and had warned officials months earlier that any attempt to shift control would trigger immediate legal resistance. The room tightened around that truth as Charles saw defiance. Camilla felt exclusion. William saw a boundary that had to hold, and saw a duty finally being enforced. And as the four royal names gathered around the same crisis, one forgotten incident from the past began to explain why the judges moved so firmly. To understand why the court's decision landed with such devastating force, the story must return to the one private moment that turned a family disagreement into a permanent royal breaking point that nobody could fix. Every royal crisis has a moment people later pretend was small, a glance, a sentence, a locked door, but this one had a name inside the palace walls, known only as the Windsor Vault incident. It began as a quiet request, quickly became a direct confrontation, and ended with Princess and making a decision that would echo all the way into the courtroom. The request looked harmless at first when Camilla's office had asked for temporary access to a specific Queen Elizabeth heirloom set for a major ceremonial appearance. On paper, that sounded like palace routine, but a Windsor inventory review is a private check of royal items kept under strict record where officials confirm what exists, who may use it, and under what conditions. This review carried massive danger because the listed pieces were not ordinary ornaments, belonging to a protected line of memory tied to the late monarch's private wishes, making them harder to touch than anyone around Camilla had expected, and understood the danger before others dared to name it, entering the vault room, seeing the request form waiting on the table, and stopping cold. The princess did not raise her voice because she did not need to, removing her gloves slowly, looking at the access line, and asking who had authorized Camilla's name to appear beside restricted items. A restricted item means a piece marked for limited use, not general royal borrowing, and those words mattered because they turned a simple request into a direct breach of family instruction. In that moment, Anne saw much more than paperwork, seeing pressure moving toward the legacy Elizabeth had tried to protect. Charles later confronted her in private, and the conversation cut deeper than either expected as he urged Anne not to turn a symbolic dispute into a family war. He believed restraint would protect everyone, yet Anne believed silence would do the exact opposite. The king wanted calm, but his sister wanted obedience to the past, creating a divide where he saw a wife being denied dignity, while she saw a sacred boundary being tested. Neither spoke carelessly because both knew Camilla's future standing was now tied to object she had never inherited. Then came the discovery that changed everything when a senior archivist found an earlier handwritten note attached to the heirloom registry. A registry is the official record that identifies important royal items and tracks their status, and this note warned that certain pieces must never be reassigned by pressure or marriage. That single line became the hidden backbone of the legal case, giving the judges a solid reason to separate Camilla from the heirloom claim entirely, proving the past had not faded, but had waited for the right moment. When Charles learned the Windsor Vault incident had been used against him in court, the private confrontation he had avoided became completely impossible to escape. Barakut Adala Kelanjitan Narasi voice over Untuk Bab 2, Target Sekatar 8.000 Karakter. Yang Disusin Tampa Jita Waktu Dan Tampasa Bagian, Disajikan Dalam versi Bahasa Inggris Diikuti Ola versi Terjemahan Bahasa Indonesia Sesuai Dengan Instruksi Sebelumnya. B. Narasi voiceover. BAB2, Target 8.000 Karakter, versi Bahasa Inggris. Because once the dark past was placed openly on the table, Charles could no longer hide behind formal procedure, and Camilla could no longer pretend the painful rejection was only a temporary legal misunderstanding. The most dangerous royal confrontations rarely happen in grand, echoing halls under the watch of historical paintings, but they happen behind tightly closed doors with no cameras, no cheering crowds, and no official palace statement ready to soften the immense damage. This critical confrontation began with Charles standing stiffly beside a marble fireplace, Camilla seated in heavy silence, William tightly controlled but noticeably tense, and Anne flatly refusing to look away from her brother's eyes. Charles had called this urgent meeting because silence was no longer a valid protection for the family. The court ruling had already deeply wounded Camilla's standing, and now the palace had to decide whether to accept the humiliating judgment quietly or let her challenge it in public, risking further exposure. A judgment, in plain words, is the court's final decision on a dispute, and this specific one mattered because it did far more than settle the legal ownership of old chests. It placed a permanent limit around the king's private influence, making clear that even his highest personal wishes could not reach into every protected part of royal history. Charles desperately wanted a strategic response that defended his wife without making his crown look weak or desperate before the global media, but everyone in the room knew the hard truth. Any public challenge would inevitably expose even more private family instructions that the public was never meant to see. William arrived knowing the legal result could not be easily reversed by royal decree, and Anne knew it too, which made her absolute calmness feel incredibly dangerous to the couple. A family instruction means a private written direction left by a deceased monarch to guide how certain royal objects should be protected or used for generations. If those private instructions were dragged further into public view, the damage would not only fall on Camilla, but it would fall directly on Charles, on the late Queen's memory, and on the monarchy's core claim that duty always comes before private desire. William understood that existential risk perfectly, while Anne had already chosen to face it head-on, regardless of the emotional cost. Camilla finally spoke, and her trembling words changed the air in the room instantly, as she asked why everyone kept calling it protection when to her it felt like a cruel public punishment. Charles looked toward her with sorrow, but his answer would not come cleanly, because he wanted to comfort her, yet he knew that comfort could sound like a dangerous admission that boundaries had been crossed. Camilla did not ask for empty sympathy from the family, but she asked why being accepted beside the king still left her completely outside the objects that carried true royal meaning. The heavy silence after that sharp question felt heavier than any corporate accusation, hanging over them like a thick fog. William answered before Charles could rescue the moment, telling the king that this was not about personal humiliation but about historical trust. The heirlooms were never meant to repair anyone's modern reputation, and once he said those sharp words, the room turned noticeably colder. And then revealed that more restricted items existed than Camilla's office had ever realized, meaning the judgment might not just block one single collection, but it could block her future access far beyond it. Charles turned sharply toward and demanded to know who had given her the ultimate authority to challenge his household. She did not soften her stance. She did not explain herself twice, but she answered with one devastating phrase, stating it was the person who left the instruction. Camilla pushed back her chair and walked out of the room, leaving Charles staying frozen in place, William saying nothing, and remaining perfectly steady. And when the heavy door closed behind Camilla, everyone left in the room understood that the true force behind the ruling was not personal anger, but absolute control. The jewels were never just shining jewels, but they were family memory turned into binding law, grief turned into strict guardianship, and royal history locked behind signatures Charles could not erase. The judges had not acted on sudden emotion or public opinion, but they had followed a chain of control so carefully built that even the king found himself standing helplessly outside it. Charles understood the full weight of that chain only when the official trust summary was placed directly before his eyes on the desk. A trust, in simple terms, is a legal arrangement that protects certain items and decides who can control, use, or pass them on to future heirs. This specific trust was not built around modern convenience, but it was built around ancient legacy, separating certain royal objects completely from the king's personal choice. This meant Charles could wear the grand crown, command the vast household, and carry the official title, but still be blocked from redirecting pieces that had been protected for future generations. Camilla's high position made the wound sharper because she was the queen, but the judges had made clear that her title did not give her automatic rights over every object touched by royal history. That mattered immensely, because the monarchy is not held together by grand titles alone, but it is held together by rules, memory, and the shared belief that some symbols are bigger than one person's private pain. For Camilla, the ruling created a cruel, visible divide, allowing her to stand beside Charles in public ceremony, but preventing her from stepping freely into the guarded inheritance of the late Queen's private line. Charles studied the legal summary alone, his aging hand resting near Elizabeth's elegant signature, no longer looking angry because anger would have been easier than this quiet defeat. Instead, the king felt a profound form of defeat, the kind that comes when a powerful man realizes his power has met a solid wall built by someone he once loved and still could not challenge. Elizabeth had not shouted from the past, but she had written carefully, protected quietly, and left behind instructions strong enough to survive his reign. And met William in a small side room away from the immense pressure of Charles and the deep hurt surrounding Camilla. The princess admitted that enforcing the boundary would wound her brother, but failing to enforce it would be a total betrayal of the woman who created it. William understood her completely, knowing the responsibility now placed on them was not merely symbolic, but deeply practical. The documents officially named custodians, meaning trusted guardians given practical authority over all access requests, and those names explicitly included him and Anne. Then came the sudden warning from a palace legal advisor that changed the mood again, telling Charles that if he pushed back, the public might learn exactly which heirlooms Camilla had attempted to claim. That was the true danger hidden beneath the judgment, not only a legal defeat, but a massive public exposure of greed. Charles absorbed the warning in total silence, but the consequences were already moving far beyond his ability to control them. Somewhere inside the palace, Camilla was about to learn that the court ruling had stopped being a mere document and had begun changing her daily life. Because the first real consequence did not arrive as a loud headline or a political speech, but as a quiet refusal delivered directly to Camilla's own door. The quiet fallout from a major royal crisis does not always sound like thunderous debates, but sometimes it sounds like a soft knock at the door, a hesitant voice from a servant, and a precise sentence that no one wants to say out loud. For Camilla, the unyielding new reality arrived through a high-ranking palace official holding a revised access list, and in that devastating moment, the court ruling officially stopped being abstract legal language and became a stinging personal humiliation. She heard the message clearly before her mind fully accepted its permanence. The palace apparatus had immediately begun implementing the judgment, meaning the old paths of personal approval were being formally closed one by one without exception. Access protocols are the strict rules that decide exactly who may request, handle, or wear highly protected royal items for any occasion. These rules turned the judgment from a mere courtroom decision into daily palace practice across all properties. The ruling no longer sat inside a locked legal file, but it actively moved through scheduling books, vault appointments, and future ceremonial plans, altering what Camilla could realistically expect and what Charles could no longer promise. Several historic items once widely expected for her upcoming international engagements would no longer be available for her to wear. Ceremonial collections were now being reviewed under a tighter, independent control framework, and private vault appointments were restricted completely. To an outsider, it might have sounded like standard bureaucratic procedure, but to Camilla, it felt like an absolute rejection delivered politely enough to make any public protest look undignified and petty. Camilla sat silently at her grand dressing table as the notice was explained, looking at her reflection. She had chosen elegant leather gloves for the ceremony already, a small act of preparation that suddenly felt entirely foolish. She removed them slowly and placed them aside, as if setting down her own pride. She was not losing a physical jewel, but she was losing her long-sought certainty within the institution. The Queen Consort had genuinely believed that Charles's personal approval still carried enough sovereign weight to open any door, but the ruling had created a colder truth. Her future requests would now be measured by independent people who did not answer only to the king's emotional desires. Charles found her moments later, and the visible hurt between them was impossible to ignore. He looked deeply wounded because he knew the refusal had reached her desk before he could use his influence to protect her. Camilla looked up and told him directly that the judgment had successfully made her feel merely tolerated by the family rather than truly accepted. That sentence struck his heart harder than sudden anger, causing him to look away. The king desperately wanted to answer her as a husband, but his constitutional duty stood between them like a locked door. Then, a second notice arrived, confirming that all future requests would have to go through the appointed custodians, not through the king's household staff. That meant William&JHAN now held an undeniable gatekeeping role over objects Camilla once believed Charles could approve with a single signature. The humiliation had officially become a permanent administrative structure. Charles stood painfully between love and duty, between his wife and his mother's crown. He ultimately decided to speak to William alone, hoping a private conversation between father and son could find a way to soften the damage. But the meeting would quickly become the final turning point that stripped the crisis down to its raw, emotional truth. Standing on opposite sides of a historical wound, Charles asked William to consider a softer arrangement that would allow the Queen Consort limited ceremonial access without reopening the legal dispute. To him, it was not rebellion against the ruling, but an act of mercy. William heard the request patiently, but he fully understood the danger. Any small exception would weaken the judgment and suggest that the heirlooms could still be used as tools of negotiation. The prince knew that once one door opened for sympathy, the entire defensive boundary Elizabeth had left behind would begin to collapse. He was not trying to defeat his father, but he was trying to stop the family from turning sacred memory into a bargaining table. Charles finally admitted that he felt deeply humiliated because the ruling made him look entirely powerless before his own children and sister. The king had spent his whole life preparing for command, only to discover that command had very real limits written by the mother he still revered. William spoke quietly and told him that power was not the same thing as guardianship, and that some things had to be protected even when that protection deeply hurt the people closest to them. Elizabeth's instruction was never written against Camilla personally, but against any pressure that might distort the heirloom's meaning. The late queen had guarded a permanent principle. Charles absorbed that distinction in silence, and it changed everything. If he chose to challenge the judgment now, he would turn private pain into a massive national argument about Elizabeth's dying wishes, forcing the public to choose between sympathy for the living and loyalty to the dead. That was a toxic battle the monarchy could not afford to fight. Charles left the room a changed man, ready to accept the ruling publicly, even as her humiliation was about to become the country's biggest headline. By the next morning, Britain woke up to a massive royal earthquake. The judgment was everywhere, on every broadcast and newspaper front page. What had started as a private family dispute over old heirlooms had become a national verdict on belonging, memory, and royal legitimacy. The palace released a controlled statement bowing to the decision completely. By accepting it openly, Charles was protecting the monarchy from deeper exposure, but he was also allowing Camilla's public defeat to stand permanently. Camilla did not enter the room until the television broadcast ended. To the public, the statement sounded like perfect order, but to her, it felt like an immense distance written in cold royal language. She had not only been denied access to jewels, but she had been placed outside a sacred circle that everyone could now see clearly. William saw the front page and said nothing, while Catherine noticed the intense tension in his face as he folded the paper carefully. The headline was impossible to ignore, reading simply, "Heirlooms denied." Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered, drawn by the sense that something historic had permanently shifted. One elderly woman told a broadcaster that some things belong to history, not to modern power. That sentence spread quickly, because it perfectly captured what many were already thinking. Camilla's supporters saw cruelty, while her critics saw justice, but everyone saw a clear, unbreakable boundary. Charles accepted the judgment without any further appeal, and that final choice carried the heavy weight of total surrender. He knew another legal fight would drag Elizabeth's private instructions into a much deeper, uglier public battle. Accepting it meant Charles was choosing historical silence over personal resistance because the monarchy survives by making its most painful choices look perfectly steady and planned. Camilla heard the final decision from Charles himself during a private evening walk. He spoke softly, his voice heavy because he knew every word would sound like total abandonment to her ears. She did not interrupt, understanding that the disputed collection was now completely beyond her reach permanently. The palace officially confirmed future heirloom access would strictly follow those restrictions, ending her claim not as a temporary setback, but as a final, permanent boundary. Camilla quietly removed her own name from the next ceremonial request list, a small act that said far more than any official complaint could have. Withdrawing her name meant she fully accepted that certain symbols would never fully belong to her status. She had successfully gained a golden crown beside Charles, but she had not gained every piece of the family's guarded past, and moved forward with steady resolve, signing the newly revised custody protocol, and William approved the final structure soon after. The prince was not celebrating Camilla's loss, but he was protecting a line that the high court judges had now made completely impossible for anyone to ignore. The historic objects had become absolute proof that royal marriage and royal legacy are not the same thing. The final truth settled heavily over them all. Charles was humiliated because his crown had clear limits, Camilla was wounded because acceptance had boundaries, and stood firm because duty demanded it, and William carried the future because someone had to guard what remained. The monarchy survived because its deepest symbols were placed far beyond personal desire. The crown had firmly chosen memory over comfort, duty over emotion, and legacy over one woman's claim.